Sometimes the people we judge the hardest are the ones who end up saving us. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find the courage to stand up for what's right. Deep in the wooded hills lives Etta Granger, a woman the town has whispered about for 20 years. They call her the Mountain Woman and keep their distance. But one stormy night, a beaten young woman stumbles to her door, barely alive, whispering, "They beat me, I'm dying." What happens next will change everything. Etta could turn away like she did once before, a choice that haunted her for decades. But this time, she makes a different decision. What happens when a woman with nothing left to lose stands against the most powerful men in town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountain like a veil, soft and persistent, the way memory clings to the heart. Etta Granger stood on her porch, a steaming cup of chicory coffee warming her weathered hands, watching the sun break through the pine trees in golden shafts. She'd always loved this hour, when the world was still deciding whether to wake or sleep a bit longer, when silence held more truth than words ever could. Her cabin sat nestled in a clearing she'd carved out herself over the years. Timber walls, solid and square, built to last through mountain winters that could break a weaker spirit. The roof was good. She'd patched it just last month with cedar shakes she'd split by hand. Firewood stacked neat against the north wall, enough to see her through to spring. A root cellar dug deep into the hillside, lined with shelves of preserved vegetables, smoked meat, dried herbs hanging in fragrant bundles from the rafters. Everything a body needed to survive, nothing wasted, nothing frivolous. She was 62 years old, though her body felt both older and younger depending on the day. Her hands were strong, calloused from work, marked with the scars of a life lived without asking permission or forgiveness. Her face had been weathered by wind and sun into something beyond conventional beauty, a face that told stories if you cared to look. Deep lines around her eyes, from squinting at distant horizons. A mouth that had forgotten how to smile easily, but remembered how to set firm when necessary. 20 years she'd been up here. 20 years since Coldwater Springs had driven her out with their fear and their judgment, their whispers and their lies. 20 years since they'd called her a witch, a danger, a woman who meddled with things better left to God and proper doctors. The memory still stung, sharp as a winter wind cutting through worn wool. She'd been 42 then, still had her husband Daniel, still had hope that reason might prevail over superstition. She'd been tending to a child, Samuel Reeves, helping him through a fever that had taken hold fierce and fast. She'd done everything right, willow bark tea for the fever, cool compresses, constant monitoring. But children are fragile things, and sometimes the fever wins no matter what you do. When Samuel died, his father, Sheriff Dalton Reeves, needed someone to blame. It couldn't be his own negligence. Couldn't be the fact that he'd waited 2 days before seeking help. Couldn't be the simple, cruel truth that sometimes children die, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. No, it had to be Etta's herbs, her unnatural knowledge, her interference with God's will. The town had turned on her like a pack of dogs catching scent of weakness. Reverend Thomas Whitmore had preached a sermon about false healers and the devil's work. Mayor Franklin Pierce had suggested in his oily way that perhaps it would be best if she and Daniel found somewhere else to live, somewhere their presence wouldn't cause such distress to grieving families. Women she'd helped birth their babies suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. Men she'd treated for ailments they were too proud to take to the distant doctor in Larkspur suddenly found reasons to cross the street when they saw her coming. Daniel had wanted to fight it. He'd stood in the town square and called them cowards and hypocrites, reminded them of every time Etta had helped them, every fever she'd broken, every wound she'd cleaned and stitched. But fear is a powerful thing, and a mob convinced of its own righteousness is deaf to reason. They'd left Coldwater Springs with what they could carry. Daniel seething with anger, Etta already retreating into the silence that would become her constant companion. They'd found this place, built this cabin, created a life away from the judgment of small minds and smaller hearts. Daniel had died 8 years ago. Art gave out one winter morning, quick and quiet, the way he'd always said he wanted to go. She'd buried him on the hillside overlooking the valley, marked his grave with a stone she'd carved herself. After that, the silence had deepened. No reason to go to town anymore, no need for human company. The mountains became her companions, the wind her conversation, the seasons her only calendar. She turned from the porch and went back inside, setting her empty cup on the table. The cabin's interior was neat, organized, a reflection of a mind that found peace in order. Her bed in one corner, quilt she'd made herself stretched tight. A sturdy table and 2 chairs, though only one ever got used now. Shelves lined one wall, filled with jars of herbs and tinctures, remedies she still made, though no one came to ask for them anymore. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, blackened with years of use, always ready with kindling and logs. On a smaller shelf near her bed sat her most precious possession, a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth from handling. She'd started keeping it 30 years ago, back when people still came to her freely, seeking help for ailments, both physical and spiritual. Every plant she'd learned about, every remedy she'd tested, every treatment that worked or failed, all recorded in her careful handwriting. Pressed flowers marked pages, their colors faded, but their shapes still recognizable. Wild bergamot for headaches, yarrow for wounds, elderberry for winter illnesses, valerian root for sleep. The journal represented everything she knew, everything she'd learned from her own mother and grandmother, combined with her own years of observation and experimentation. It was knowledge the town had called witchcraft, but it was simply understanding of how the natural world provided what bodies needed to heal. If you knew where to look and how to use it, Etta moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. Check the water barrel, make sure it's full from last night's rain. Feed the chickens scratching around in their coop beside the cabin. Collect eggs still warm. Tend the small garden where she grew vegetables, hardy enough to survive at this altitude. Pull a few weeds, check the plants for disease or pest damage. The physical work settled her mind, always had. There was honesty in labor, in coaxing life from soil and seed, in building and maintaining with your own hands. The town could take many things from her reputation, her place in society, her sense of belonging. But they couldn't take her knowledge, her skills, her ability to survive. That was hers alone. By midday, she'd preserved a batch of wild mushrooms she'd collected the day before, soaked and cleaned, and packed them in brine. She'd repaired a weak spot in the chicken coop where a fox had been testing the fence. She'd split more firewood, the steady rhythm of the axe falling like a heartbeat. Reliable and necessary, as afternoon shadows lengthened, she allowed herself to sit, to rest her back against the porch post and watch the play of light through the trees. This was when the memories came most persistently, when her hands were still and her mind had space to wander paths she usually kept closed. She thought about her daughter, Margaret. Beautiful, headstrong Margaret, who'd left for the city when she was 19, eager to escape the stigma of being the mountain woman's daughter. They'd exchanged letters at first, Margaret's full of excitement about her new life, her job at a dress shop, the people she was meeting. Then the letters had slowed, then stopped altogether. Etta had written but received no replies. Eventually she'd stopped writing too, accepting what seemed obvious. Margaret had moved on, had built a new life where having a disgraced mother didn't hold her back. It had been 15 years since she'd heard from Margaret. 15 years of wondering if her daughter was happy, if she'd married, if there were grandchildren Etta would never meet. The not knowing was its own kind of grief, different from Daniel's death, but no less painful. At least with death there was finality, a clear line between before and after. This was just absence, stretching on, filled with questions that had no answers. She pushed the thoughts away, as she'd learned to do. Dwelling on what couldn't be changed only invited bitterness, and she'd seen what bitterness did to people, turned them hard and cold, killed the parts of them that could still feel joy or wonder. She refused to let that happen. If solitude was to be her life, she'd make it a deliberate choice. not a slow surrender to resentment. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took her breath away, even after 20 years of watching. This was beauty that asked nothing of her, judged nothing about her, simply existed in its own magnificent way. She found comfort in that. She went inside as darkness fell, lit the oil lamps that cast warm circles of light through the cabin, made herself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, ate slowly, tasting every bite, washed her dishes in the basin, dried them carefully, put them away. These rituals mattered, kept her tethered to purpose and routine. As she prepared for bed, a strange restlessness came over her. She paused, standing in the middle of the cabin, trying to identify the feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close to it, a sense that change was coming, that the careful equilibrium she'd built was about to be disrupted. She walked to the window, looked out at the darkness beyond. The wind had picked up, bending the treetops, carrying the smell of rain. A storm was coming. She could feel it in her bones, the way old injuries always predicted weather changes. But this felt like more than weather, more than the simple turning of seasons. She shook her head at her own fancy. 20 years alone had made her too introspective, too inclined to read meaning into feelings that were probably just the result of a long day and tired muscles. She was getting old, that was all. Old and maybe a little lonely, though she'd never admit it out loud. Still, as she climbed into bed and pulled the quilt up to her chin, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the life she'd built in careful isolation was about to crack open in ways she couldn't predict or control. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the roof like fingers knocking, asking to be let in. Etta closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but the restlessness remained, a low hum beneath her thoughts. Somewhere in the darkness, something was moving toward her. She didn't know what it was yet, didn't know if it would bring blessing or curse. But it was coming, as inevitable as the storm, as certain as the sunrise that would follow. She'd spent 20 years building walls, keeping the world at bay, protecting herself from further pain and disappointment. But walls, no matter how strong, can't stand forever. Eventually, something finds the crack, the weak spot, the place where the mortar has crumbled. For Etta Granger, that moment was approaching faster than she knew, carried on the wings of a storm, and the desperate flight of a woman she'd never met, but would come to love like the daughter she'd lost. The mountain stood silent and watchful, keeping its secrets, waiting to see what the storm would bring. And in her cabin, surrounded by her herbs and her memories and her carefully constructed solitude, Etta Granger slept her last peaceful night before everything changed. The storm hit with a fury that surprised even Etta, who'd weathered 2 decades of mountain tempests. Rain came in sheets, driven sideways by wind that screamed through the trees like something alive and angry. Thunder rolled across the valley in waves, shaking the cabin's walls, rattling the windows in their frames. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, illuminating the clearing in brief. Stark flashes that left after-images burned into Etta's vision. She'd reinforced the door, checked the shutters, made sure everything that could blow away was secured or brought inside. Now she sat by the fire, trying to read by lamplight, but the storm's violence made concentration impossible. The chickens were huddled in their coop, silent and frightened. Even the mice that usually scurried in the walls had gone quiet, sensing the storm's unprecedented rage. It was past midnight when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a desperate, irregular thumping against her door. At first, she thought it was just a branch broken loose, blown against the wood by the wind. But then it came again, and this time there was a pattern to it, a deliberate quality that made her heart quicken. Someone was knocking. Etta stood, every instinct screaming caution. No one came to her cabin. No one had come in years, and certainly no one would be out in a storm like this unless they were running from something worse than weather. The knocking came again, weaker this time, more like scratching than pounding. And then, barely audible over the storm, a voice. A woman's voice, raw with pain and desperation. "Please, please help me." They beat me. I'm dying. The words hit Etta like a physical blow. She stood frozen, hand halfway to the door, mind racing back 20 years to another plea for help, another desperate situation. Samuel Reeves burning with fever, his mother begging her to do something, anything. She'd tried. God knows she'd tried. And when the boy died, when the fever took him, despite everything she knew, everything she did, the town had crucified her for it. She'd sworn then, in the bitter aftermath, that she'd never put herself in that position again. Never risk her knowledge and her conscience against someone else's life, only to be blamed when nature took its course, despite her best efforts. The knocking had stopped. In its place came a different sound, a soft thud, like a body sliding down the door, giving up. Etta closed her eyes, her hand trembling against the rough wood. She could walk away. She could go back to the fire, go back to her book, pretend she'd heard nothing but the storm. By morning, whoever was out there would be gone, one way or another, and her life would continue in its careful, protected pattern. But even as she thought it, she knew she couldn't, because the real reason the town's condemnation had hurt so deeply wasn't that they'd blamed her for Samuel's death, it was that she'd blamed herself. Not for anything she'd done wrong, but for the simple fact that she'd cared, that she'd tried, that she'd opened herself to the possibility of failure and grief. The townspeople had punished her for their own fear and loss. She'd punished herself for being human, and here was another chance to fail, another opportunity for pain and blame and heartbreak. But it was also a chance to be who she really was. Beneath the armor of isolation, a healer, a helper, someone who couldn't turn away from suffering even when it would be safer to do so. She lifted the bar from the door and pulled it open. The wind nearly tore it from her hands, driving rain into the cabin with stinging force. At her feet lay a young woman, soaked to the bone, face down in the mud, one hand still raised as if to knock again. Blood mixed with rainwater, running in dark rivulets across the porch boards. Dear God, Etta breathed. She knelt beside the woman, checking for a pulse. Found it weak but steady. The woman stirred at her touch, tried to speak, but only managed a wet, rattling sound. Etta made a quick decision. She couldn't assess injuries out here in the storm, couldn't even see clearly in the darkness and rain. She had to get her inside. Despite her age, Etta was strong. Years of splitting wood, hauling water, building and maintaining had kept her muscles hard and capable. She got her arms under the woman's shoulders and dragged her across the threshold into the relative safety of the cabin. Kicked the door shut behind them, shutting out the worst of the storm's fury. In the lamplight, the damage was clear and horrifying. The woman was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair plastered to her skull. Her face was a mass of bruises, one eye swollen completely shut, lips split and bleeding. Her dress, what was left of it, was torn and stained with blood and mud. Her hands were scraped raw, as if she'd clawed her way through underbrush for miles. But it was the way she held her body that told Etta the worst of it. Curved protectively around her ribs, every breath shallow and pained. Broken ribs, almost certainly. Maybe internal bleeding. Possibly worse. Etta's training took over, pushing aside emotion in favor of methodical assessment. She moved quickly, gathering supplies. Clean cloths, warm water from the kettle always simmering by the fire, her medicine box with its carefully organized contents. She lit more lamps, needing to see clearly, needing to understand the full extent of the damage. "Can you hear me?" she asked, gently kneeling beside the woman. "You're safe now. I'm going to help you, but I need to look at your injuries. Can you tell me what hurts most?" The woman's good eye opened, unfocused at first, then locking onto Etta's face with desperate intensity. "He'll kill me," she whispered. "If he finds me, he'll kill me." "No one's going to kill you," Etta said firmly. "Not while you're under my roof. Now let's see what we're dealing with." She worked carefully, cutting away the ruined dress with scissors, exposing injuries that made her jaw clench with fury. This wasn't the result of an accident or a fall. This was methodical violence, inflicted with intent to harm and terrorize. Deep bruises across the ribs, patterned in the shape of boot prints. Defensive wounds on the forearms, where she'd tried to protect her face. Older bruises too, yellow and green at the edges, evidence this wasn't the first time. The young woman drifted in and out of consciousness as Etta worked. When she was aware, she whimpered with pain. When she slipped under, her breathing became more regular, her body releasing some of its terrible tension. Etta cleaned the wounds, applied salves made from comfrey and calendula to reduce swelling and promote healing. She wrapped the ribs carefully, tight enough to provide support, but not so tight as to restrict breathing. She checked for signs of concussion, pupils responsive if sluggish. Checked for internal bleeding, belly soft, no distension or rigidity. The injuries were severe, but not beyond her ability to treat. Not beyond the woman's ability to survive. As she worked, she noticed something clutched in the woman's hand, so tightly gripped that even unconscious, her fingers wouldn't release it. Etta gently pried the fingers open and found a ring. A simple gold wedding band, torn and twisted as if it had been ripped from someone's finger with force. The sight of it made Etta's heart sink. She understood now in that terrible certain way. This wasn't a random attack by strangers. This was domestic violence, the kind that happened behind closed doors, hidden by social niceties and family reputation. The kind that festered in darkness because no one wanted to see it. No one wanted to believe that respectable men could be monsters in their own homes. She set the ring aside and continued her work, mixing a tea of willow bark and valerian root to ease pain and help the woman sleep. When it was ready, she lifted the woman's head carefully and helped her drink, supporting her weight, murmuring encouragement. "That's it. Just a little more. This will help with the pain. You're going to be all right. I promise you, you're going to be all right." The woman's good eye fixed on her again, and this time there was something like hope in it, fragile and uncertain. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, words slurred with exhaustion and pain. "My name is Etta Granger," she replied. "And you're safe here. Whatever you're running from, whoever hurt you, they can't reach you here. They'll come," the woman whispered, fear making her try to sit up, agitation undoing Etta's careful positioning. "They'll come looking. They always—" "Hush now," Etta said, easing her back down. "Let them come. This mountain has been my home for 20 years, and I know every path, every hiding place, every approach. No one comes up here that I don't know about. You're safe. I give you my word." The tea was taking effect, the woman's eye growing heavy, her breathing deepening despite the pain. But before she slipped into sleep, she grabbed Etta's hand with surprising strength, pulling her close. "Sarah," she said. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. Please don't let them take me back, please." "I won't," Etta said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I won't let anyone take you anywhere you don't want to go. You have my word on that." Sarah's grip relaxed, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion and the medicine's effects. Within moments, she was deeply asleep, her breathing steady if still shallow from the broken ribs. Etta sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of how much her own body ached from the exertion, how her heart was pounding, how her hands were shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed. She looked at the unconscious woman, Sarah, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over her like a physical thing. She'd opened her door. She'd let someone back into her carefully protected life. And with that decision came consequences she couldn't yet imagine. Complications that would ripple outward in ways both terrible and necessary. Outside, the storm continued its rage, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm had begun. One that would ultimately force Etta to confront not just the people who'd driven her out 20 years ago, but the choices she'd made since, the life she'd built on avoidance and isolation, the guilt she'd carried for failing to save a child, and the daughter she'd lost to silence and shame. She looked at the torn wedding ring lying on her table, caught in the lamplight, and felt a cold certainty settle into her bones. Whoever had done this to Sarah, whoever had beaten her nearly to death and driven her into a storm rather than face another moment of that violence, they would come looking for her. And when they did, they would find not a helpless victim, but Etta Granger standing between them and their prey. Let them come, she thought, feeling something long dormant stirring in her chest. Let them come and learn what it means to face a mountain woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. 3 days passed in a strange suspension of time, where the world beyond the cabin seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of healing and the watchful vigilance of protection. The storm had blown itself out by the second morning, leaving the mountain washed clean and gleaming, but inside the cabin, a different kind of weather prevailed, careful and controlled. Measured by small victories and setbacks in Sarah's recovery, Etta had moved her own bed closer to the fire and given it to Sarah, who needed the warmth more than she did. She made herself a pallet near the hearth, sleeping in shifts, always keeping one ear tuned to any change in Sarah's breathing, any sign of fever or distress. The first 48 hours were critical. She knew the time when infection could set in, when internal bleeding could declare itself, when the body decided whether it had the strength to fight back or would simply surrender to the damage done to it. Sarah drifted through those first days in a haze of pain and medication, waking only to take sips of broth or herbal tea, to have her wounds cleaned and dressed, to use the chamber pot with Etta's careful assistance. She spoke little, and when she did it was often fragmented, confused, names and places that meant nothing to Etta. Apologies for things that needed no apology. Moments of panic when she thought she was somewhere else, somewhere dangerous. "It's all right," Etta would tell her, keeping her voice low and steady. "You're safe. You're with me, Etta, in my cabin on the mountain. No one can hurt you here." By the third day, Sarah's fever had broken, and her eyes, both of them now, though one was still ringed with spectacular bruising, were clearer, more present. She watched Etta moving around the cabin with a wariness that broke Etta's heart. It was the look of someone who'd learned not to trust, not to relax, not to assume that kindness wasn't just a prelude to cruelty. Etta had seen that look before, in animals caught in traps, in children who'd known too much harsh treatment. It was the look of someone whose survival depended on constant vigilance, on reading every mood and movement for signs of danger. "You hungry?" Etta asked, keeping her movements slow and predictable as she ladled soup into a bowl. "Made vegetable stew. Nothing fancy, but it'll put strength back in your bones." Sarah nodded, pushing herself up to sitting with visible effort, one hand pressed to her wrapped ribs. Etta brought the bowl over and set it on her lap, along with a thick slice of bread and a spoon. "Take your time," she said. "Your stomach's been empty too long to rush things." She returned to her own work, grinding dried herbs with a mortar and pestle, preparing more of the salve that was helping Sarah's cuts and bruises heal. But she was acutely aware of every movement Sarah made, every wince of pain, every slight tremor in her hands as she brought the spoon to her mouth. After a while, Sarah spoke, her voice stronger than it had been. "Why are you helping me?" Etta looked up from her work. "Why wouldn't I?" "Most people wouldn't." Sarah stared down at her soup. "Most people would say a wife should stay with her husband, that whatever happens behind closed doors is private business, that if there's trouble, it must be because I did something to deserve it." The bitterness in her voice was profound, aged beyond her years. Etta set down her pestle and came to sit in the chair beside the bed, close enough to talk comfortably, but far enough to not crowd her. "I'm not most people," she said simply, "and no one deserves what was done to you. No one. I don't care what the reason was, or what anyone says about duty or vows or any of that. What I saw on my porch 3 nights ago was attempted murder, plain and simple. And I don't hold with murder." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the first real emotion she'd shown beyond fear and pain. "I tried to leave before, twice. He found me both times. Brought me back. Made sure I understood what would happen if I tried again." She set the soup aside, her hands going to a place on her left forearm, touching it gently through the bandage. When she looked up at Etta, her face was raw with remembered pain. He broke it the second time. "My arm," said next time it would be my neck. Etta felt rage rise in her throat, hot and bitter. She'd seen cruelty in her life. The casual cruelty of a town turning on someone different, the systemic cruelty of people protecting their own interests at others' expense. But this was different. This was intimate violence, personal and calculated. "Who is he?" she asked quietly. "Your husband." Sarah was silent for a long moment, and Etta could see her wrestling with something. Fear, loyalty, maybe just the ingrained habit of keeping secrets that survival had taught her. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "James Whitmore." The name hit Etta like a fist to the stomach. She kept her face carefully neutral, but inside, something cold and certain was settling into place. "Whitmore? Of course it was Whitmore. The Reverend's son," she said. "Not a question, but a confirmation." Sarah nodded, watching Etta's face carefully. "You know the family." "I know them," Etta said grimly. "I know what they are. Self-righteous, judgmental, convinced of their own superiority and everyone else's moral failing. The kind of people who use God as a weapon to control others while excusing their own sins. That's James exactly," Sarah said, something like relief in her voice at being understood. "In public he's charming, kind, everyone loves him. The golden son, being groomed to take over his father's ministry someday. Women in town think I'm the luckiest girl alive, married to such a godly, handsome man." She laughed, a sound without humor. "They don't see what he's like when the doors close, when there's no one to perform for, when it's just him and me and his anger." Etta reached out slowly, telegraphing her intention, and took Sarah's hand. "How long?" she asked. "How long has he been hurting you?" "It started about 6 months after we married," Sarah said, staring at their joined hands. "Just small things at first, criticism. The way I kept house, the way I dressed, the way I spoke. Then it was controlling, who I could see, where I could go, what I could say to people." Then she stopped, swallowed hard. "Then came the first time he hit me. I'd burned dinner. He said I did it on purpose, to embarrass him. He slapped me, then apologized, cried, swore it would never happen again. And I believed him. God help me, I believed him." "That's what they do," Etta said gently. "Men like that, they know how to make you doubt yourself, how to make you think it's your fault, how to keep you off balance so you never quite find solid ground to stand on." Sarah looked at her with sudden intensity. "How do you know? Did someone—" "No," Etta said quickly. "My Daniel was a good man, gentle and fair. But I've seen it happen to others, heard stories. And I've lived long enough to recognize certain patterns of behavior, certain kinds of calculated cruelty." She squeezed Sarah's hand gently before releasing it. "Tell me what happened. The night you came here. What finally made you run?" Sarah pulled a piece of cloth from beneath her pillow. Etta recognized it as a handkerchief, fine linen with embroidered initials. Sarah held it up, and in the lamplight the letters were clear. "T.M. I found this in James's coat pocket when I was mending it," Sarah said. "At first I thought it was his father's, Thomas Whitmore. But then I noticed it had perfume on it. Women's perfume. Not mine." Etta's eyebrows rose. "He was unfaithful. I confronted him," Sarah said, her voice shaking now with remembered fear and fury. I know I shouldn't have. I should have kept quiet, should have pretended I didn't know. But I was so tired of pretending. So tired of living in fear. So I asked him about it, and he attacked you. He was drunk. That made it worse. He screamed at me, called me names I won't repeat, said what he did was none of my business, that I had no right to question him, that I was his wife, and my only job was to obey. And then her breath caught, and Etta saw her struggling with the memory. Then he started hitting me, not just slapping this time. He used his fists, his boots. I tried to fight back, tried to protect myself, but he's so much stronger. I thought he was going to kill me. I really thought that was it. How did you get away?" "He passed out," Sarah said. "Finally drank himself unconscious right there on the floor. I knew I had maybe a few hours before he woke up, so I ran. Didn't take anything but the clothes on my back. Didn't even know where I was going, just knew I had to get as far away as possible. And you walked all the way up the mountain in that storm. I didn't know where else to go," Sarah said, tears flowing freely now. "My family disowned me when I married James, said I was getting ideas above my station, marrying a reverend's son. Said I'd made my bed and would have to lie in it. I have no friends in town. James made sure of that. Isolated me completely. The sheriff—" She stopped and something passed across her face. Fear, but also a kind of knowing resignation. The sheriff is James's godfather, she finished quietly. Dalton Reeves. He's known James since he was born. There's no way he'd believe me over James. No way he'd help me. Etta felt the pieces clicking into place, creating a picture that was both clear and deeply disturbing. Sheriff Reeves, who'd blamed her for his son's death 20 years ago. Reverend Whitmore, who'd condemned her from the pulpit. And now James Whitmore, the golden son, the heir apparent, protected by both family name and community blind spots. So you came to me, Etta said. To the woman everyone in town calls dangerous and unnatural. I came to the only person I thought might help me, without asking questions or judging me, Sarah said. I'd heard stories about you. The mountain woman who lives alone, who knows herbs and healing, who the town drove out years ago. I figured, she paused, choosing her words carefully. I figured maybe someone they treated badly would understand what it's like to need help and have nowhere to turn. Etta felt something shift in her chest, some wall she'd built beginning to crack. You figured right, she said simply. And you were brave to come here, braver than you probably know. I don't feel brave, Sarah said. I feel terrified. Because he will come looking for me. And when he finds me, he won't find you, Etta interrupted firmly. Not unless you want to be found. And even then, he'll have to go through me first. By the end of the first week, Sarah was strong enough to move around the cabin without help, though she still favored her ribs and tired easily. Etta watched her gradual transformation with quiet satisfaction, the way color returned to her face, the way her movements became more confident, the way the constant fear in her eyes began to fade into something more like cautious hope. But Etta knew better than to assume they were safe. Every night she checked the perimeter of her property, looking for signs of disturbance, tracks that didn't belong, broken branches that might indicate someone had been watching. She slept with Daniel's rifle within arm's reach, loaded and ready. She'd cleaned it thoroughly that first night after Sarah arrived, oiled the mechanism, tested the sight. It felt strange in her hands after so many years of disuse, but the muscle memory was still there, the knowledge of how to aim and fire if necessary. One morning, as dawn broke soft and golden over the mountain, Etta took Sarah out to the woodshed behind the cabin. She'd been thinking about this for days, weighing the risks and benefits, and had finally decided it was necessary. I'm going to teach you some things, Etta said, her breath misting in the cool air. Things that might save your life if you ever need to run again. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, still healing but eager. What kind of things? Survival skills, Etta said simply. She gestured to the forest surrounding them. This mountain has been my home for 20 years. I know every path, every water source, every place where food grows wild. I know how to move through the woods without leaving a trail, how to hide so well you'd walk right past me without knowing I was there. And I'm going to teach you. Over the following days, they established a routine. Mornings were for healing and rest. Sarah's body still needed time to knit itself back together. But afternoons became lessons in self-reliance that Sarah absorbed with an intensity that reminded Etta of herself at that age. Hungry for knowledge that would make her less dependent on anyone else's goodwill or protection, Etta taught her which plants were safe to eat and which would make you sick or worse. She showed her how to identify animal tracks, how to find water by following the paths deer made through the underbrush, how to build a fire without matches using flint and dry moss. She demonstrated how to move quietly through the forest, stepping on rocks and roots instead of dry leaves, how to use the wind to mask sound and scent, how to read the sky for weather signs. Knowledge is the one thing no one can take from you, Etta told her one afternoon as they sat on a fallen log. Sarah practicing the knots Etta had shown her for securing shelter. They can take your home, your money, your sense of safety. But what you know, what you've learned and practiced and made part of yourself, that's yours forever. Sarah's fingers worked the rope, creating the pattern Etta had demonstrated. My mother used to say something similar, she said quietly. Before she turned her back on me, she said education was wasted on girls, but she still taught me to read and write in secret. Said it was the only power she had to give me. She was right, Etta said, though I wish she'd had the courage to stand by you when you needed her. She was afraid, Sarah said, not defending but explaining. My father has a hard hand and a harder heart. She learned young to keep her head down, to not make waves. I think maybe she saw me as a way out, marrying up, getting away from poverty. She didn't understand that money and respectability don't protect you from cruelty. Sometimes they just hide it better. Etta reached over and corrected Sarah's grip on the rope. There, she said. That's it. Pull it tight. A good knot can save your life, secure a shelter, help you climb, even be used for defense if you need it. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Sarah now strong enough to help with simple tasks, Etta made a decision. She went to the shelf where she kept her medicine journal and brought it to the table, setting it down between them. This represents 30 years of my life's work, she said, running her hand over the worn leather cover. Every plant I've studied, every remedy I've tested, every treatment I've learned from my mother and grandmother and my own experience. I want you to read it. Learn from it. Sarah looked at the journal with something like reverence. Are you sure? Knowledge that isn't shared dies with the person who holds it, Etta said. I've been selfish with what I know, keeping it to myself out of hurt, pride, and fear. But maybe that's not what this knowledge is for. Maybe it's meant to be passed on, used to help people, the way it was passed on to me. She pushed the journal toward Sarah. You don't have to become a healer. That's not what I'm saying. But I want you to understand that you have value beyond what any man says about you. You have the capacity to learn, to grow, to become someone who can take care of herself and others. That's power, real power. The kind that can't be beaten out of you or controlled. Sarah opened the journal carefully, her fingers tracing the pressed flowers that marked the pages, reading the neat handwriting that documented decades of careful observation. James never let me read anything but the Bible, she said softly. Said women didn't need education, that it just gave them dangerous ideas. Then he was afraid of you, Etta said. Afraid of what you might become if you were allowed to think for yourself, to learn, to grow beyond his ability to control you. That's what men like him do. They keep you small and dependent, so they can feel big and powerful. Over the next few days, as Sarah studied the journal and practiced the skills Etta taught her, something remarkable began to happen. The frightened, broken woman who'd collapsed on Etta's doorstep started to transform into someone stronger, more confident, more present in her own skin. She still had moments of fear, still flinched at sudden noises, still woke from nightmares. But there was steel forming in her spine, determination hardening in her eyes. One afternoon, Etta brought out Daniel's rifle. Sarah's eyes widened when she saw it. I don't know if I could, she started to say. You don't have to shoot anyone, Etta said. But you should know how, just in case. Knowledge, remember? It's power. She showed Sarah how to hold the rifle properly, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger smoothly. They practiced with unloaded weapons at first, Sarah getting used to the weight and feel of it. Then when Etta was confident Sarah understood the safety procedures, they moved to actual shooting. The first shot made Sarah jump, the recoil surprising her despite Etta's warnings. But she set her jaw and tried again, and again. By the end of the afternoon, she was hitting the target Etta had set up, a piece of bark marked with charcoal. More often than not. Good, Etta said, pride evident in her voice. You're a natural. Must be all that determination you've got bottled up inside, finally finding an outlet. Sarah lowered the rifle, and when she looked at Etta, her eyes were bright with tears. But they weren't tears of fear or pain this time. They were tears of recognition, of power reclaimed, of possibility opening up where before there'd been only hopelessness. Thank you, she said, for all of this, for saving my life, for teaching me, her voice broke, for making me feel like I'm worth saving. Etta pulled her into a careful hug, mindful of her still healing ribs. You were always worth saving, she said firmly. What was done to you, that wasn't about your worth. That was about his weakness, his cruelty, his need to feel powerful by making someone else feel powerless. You hear me? None of that was your fault. None of it. Sarah clung to her, and in that moment Etta felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Not just the purpose of daily survival, of maintaining and enduring, but the deeper purpose of mattering to someone, of making a difference in another person's life, of using her knowledge and strength to help rather than just to protect herself. That night, as Sarah slept peacefully for the first time since arriving, no nightmares, no startling awake in panic, Etta sat by the fire and allowed herself to think about the future. Not just the immediate future of keeping Sarah safe, but the longer view of what might come after. For 20 years, she'd told herself that isolation was freedom, that needing no one meant no one could hurt her. But sitting there in the firelight, listening to Sarah's steady breathing, she realized that hadn't been freedom at all. It had been a different kind of prison, one she'd built for herself out of fear and hurt pride. Maybe, she thought, this was a chance to break free of that prison. Maybe helping Sarah wasn't just about saving one young woman from an abusive husband. Maybe it was about reclaiming her own life, her own purpose, her own connection to the world she'd been hiding from. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, its voice clear and strong. Etta listened to it, feeling something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow they would continue preparing, learning, growing stronger together. But tonight they were safe. Tonight they had each other. And for now, that was enough. 2 weeks had passed since the storm, and the mountain had settled into the gentle rhythm of late autumn. Leaves turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the air carried that particular crispness that promised winter wasn't far behind. Sarah had healed remarkably well, her bruises fading from purple to yellow to almost gone, her ribs no longer painful with every breath, her cuts sealed and scarring over. But more than her body had healed. There was a confidence in her now that hadn't been there before. A way of holding herself that spoke of strength discovered rather than confidence borrowed. She moved through the cabin and the surrounding woods with increasing assurance, applying the lessons Etta had taught her. Absorbing knowledge like parched earth absorbs rain. They developed a companionship that surprised Etta with its depth. Sarah was curious, thoughtful, willing to work hard and learn quickly. She asked questions that showed real intelligence, made observations that demonstrated genuine insight. More than once, Etta found herself laughing at something Sarah said, actual laughter, the kind that came from the belly and left you breathless. The kind she hadn't experienced since Daniel died. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, Sarah mentioned something that made Etta's hands still over the vegetables she was chopping. When I was working in the house, James's house, I used to hear conversations, Sarah said carefully, between James and his father. Sometimes the mayor would be there too. They'd send me away, but I learned to listen from the next room. They thought I was too stupid or too scared to pay attention. What kind of conversations? Etta asked, keeping her voice neutral but her attention sharp. Business mostly. Land deals. Church matters. But Sarah paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. There was money changing hands that didn't seem right. The mayor would talk about properties he was acquiring, always through the church somehow. The reverend would sign papers, and money would appear in accounts that James managed. They called it God's work, but it felt more like theft, dressed up in religious language. Etta set down her knife and turned to face Sarah fully. "Tell me more." "There was a widow, Mrs. Henderson," Sarah continued. "She owned land adjacent to the church. Good land, with a stream running through it. The Reverend visited her often, offering spiritual comfort after her husband died. Within 3 months, she'd signed the land over to the church for a fraction of what it was worth. The mayor bought it from the church the next day for even less, then sold it to some mining company for 10 times what he'd paid. And no one questioned this." "Who would?" Sarah asked bitterly. "The Reverend is the most respected man in town. The mayor is his friend. The sheriff is family. They protect each other, cover for each other. Anyone who asks questions gets told they're questioning God's will or spreading malicious gossip." Etta felt anger rising in her chest, but it was a cold, calculating anger rather than the hot rage of earlier. This was information. This was leverage. This was the kind of pattern that, if proven, could bring down even the most respected families. "How many deals like this were there?" she asked. "I don't know exactly," Sarah said. "But I heard enough to know it wasn't just once or twice. There's a system to it. The Reverend identifies vulnerable people, widows, families in debt, anyone desperate or trusting. He offers help, comfort, guidance. Then comes the suggestion that maybe selling their land to the church would solve their problems. The church pays below market value, but more than the desperate person thought they could get. Then the church immediately sells to the mayor or one of his associates for even less, claiming it's all being done for charitable purposes. The mayor then flips it for massive profit, and James manages the accounts," Etta said, seeing the full picture now. "He keeps the books," Sarah confirmed. "Make sure everything looks legitimate on paper. He's clever with numbers, always has been. He can make theft look like charity, embezzlement look like careful stewardship." Etta was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications. "Sarah, this is bigger than just you running from an abusive husband. If what you're telling me is true, and I believe it is, then the Whitmore family has been systematically defrauding people for years. Maybe decades, I know," Sarah said softly. "And that's why I can never go back. Even if James promised never to hurt me again, even if I could somehow live with him, I'd be complicit in all of it. I'd know what they were doing and stay silent." "I can't do that." "You don't have to," Etta said firmly. She went to her small desk in the corner and pulled out paper and a pencil. "I want you to write down everything you remember. Every deal you heard about, every name, every date if you can recall it. Every detail, no matter how small." Sarah took the paper and pencil with trembling hands. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Etta admitted. "But knowledge is power, remember? And right now, we need all the power we can gather. If the time comes when we need to defend ourselves, to protect you, to make sure you're not forced back into that situation, having evidence of their corruption might be the only weapon we have." Over the next few days, Sarah wrote down everything she could remember. Pages filled with names, dates, descriptions of properties, amounts of money mentioned. Some details were clear, others fuzzy, but the pattern was undeniable. The Whitmore family, aided by Mayor Pierce and protected by Sheriff Reeves, had been running a systematic scheme to defraud vulnerable people of their property and money, all while maintaining their reputation as pillars of the community. Etta read through the pages Sarah had written, her mind working through possibilities. This information was dangerous. If the wrong people knew Sarah had this knowledge, they wouldn't just want her. Back, they'd want her silenced permanently. One afternoon, as Etta was gathering herbs near the edge of her property, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. Fresh tracks. Boot prints. A man's, by the size and weight of them. They came up the mountain trail, circled around her clearing at a distance, then retreated back down. She was being watched. They were looking for Sarah, and they'd found Etta's cabin. She rushed back to the cabin, keeping her face calm, but her heart racing. Sarah was inside, reading the medicine journal, peaceful and unaware. "Sarah," Etta said carefully, "I need you to listen to me and not panic. Someone was here today. Not close, but close enough to know there's a cabin here, close enough to be searching." The color drained from Sarah's face. "James, maybe, or someone working for him. Either way, we need to be more careful. No going outside during the day unless absolutely necessary. Keep away from the windows." And she went to the rifle, checked that it was loaded. "We need to be ready for the possibility that they might come here." "What will we do?" Sarah asked, fear creeping back into her voice despite her newfound confidence. "We'll be smart," Etta said. "We know this mountain better than they do. We're prepared, and we have something they don't expect. We're not going to just roll over and accept whatever they decide. We're going to fight back one way or another." That night, Etta kept watch from the darkened cabin, looking out at the moonlit clearing, listening for any sound that didn't belong. Beside her, Sarah tried to rest, but kept startling awake. the progress of the past 2 weeks threatened by the knowledge that her pursuers were getting closer. Etta laid a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever comes, we face it together," she said quietly. "You're not alone in this anymore." "You hear me? You're not alone," Sarah nodded, some of her fear receding in the face of Etta's calm certainty. But both women knew that the peaceful interlude they'd enjoyed was coming to an end. The outside world was closing in, bringing with it all the danger and complications they'd been preparing for. The question now wasn't whether they'd have to confront James and the people protecting him. The question was when and how, and whether they'd survive the confrontation when it came. The discovery of the tracks changed everything. What had been a sanctuary became a fortress. What had been healing time became preparation for battle. Etta moved through the transformation with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years thinking about survival, planning for scenarios she'd hoped would never come to. She showed Sarah the escape routes she'd mapped out years ago, paths through the dense forest that only someone who knew the mountain intimately could follow, hiding places where a person could disappear even with searchers all around. Markers only she would recognize that could guide someone back to safety even in darkness or snow. "If they come and I tell you to run, you run," Etta instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You follow this path here," she pointed to a barely visible trail, "until you reach the lightning-struck pine. From there you head north toward the ridge. There's a cave hidden behind a rockfall. You can stay there for days if you need to. There's a spring nearby for water, and I've cached supplies, dried food, blankets, matches." "I won't leave you," Sarah said stubbornly. "You will if I say so," Etta countered. "Because if something happens to me, and you're still here, caught, then everything I've done, everything we've worked for, will have been for nothing. Your survival is the priority, your freedom, your ability to eventually tell the truth about what the Whitmores have done. You understand?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I understand," but Etta had no intention of letting it come to that if she could help it. Over the next few days, she made trips down the mountain under cover of darkness, moving like the ghost she'd become, gathering information, assessing the situation in Coldwater Springs. What she found was both alarming and useful. The town was buzzing with rumors about Sarah's disappearance. James Whitmore was playing the role of the devastated husband, claiming his wife had become unstable, might be dangerous to herself or others. Sheriff Reeves had organized search parties, though they'd been focusing on the roads leading out of town, assuming Sarah had fled to the city. No one seemed to think she'd gone up the mountain. After all, who would be foolish enough to climb into wilderness during a storm? But Etta had also learned something else, something that made her blood run cold, even as it confirmed her suspicions. There were whispers, carefully suppressed but present nonetheless, about other women who'd gone missing over the years. Women who'd been involved with the Whitmore men. Women who'd known too much or threatened to talk. Women who'd simply vanished and whose disappearances had been explained away as women running off with lovers, or losing their minds, or meeting with tragic accidents. 5 women in 15 years, all with connections to the Whitmore family. All disappeared without a trace. Etta thought about Margaret, about the letters that had stopped, about 15 years of silence. And for the first time, she allowed herself to truly consider the possibility that her daughter hadn't chosen to cut ties, that perhaps she'd tried to come home and been prevented. Permanently prevented. She needed more information, needed confirmation, but she couldn't risk going directly to anyone who might alert the Whitmores. So she went to the one person in Coldwater Springs who'd ever shown her kindness even after her exile, Doc Harrington. The old doctor still lived in the same house on the edge of town. Retired now, but still respected, still trusted. Etta waited until well after midnight, then knocked softly on his back door. When he answered, holding a lamp high and squinting into the darkness, his eyes widened in recognition. "Etta Granger," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and something like relief. "I'd hoped you were still alive up there on your mountain. Come in quickly before anyone sees." Inside his cluttered study, surrounded by medical texts and the comfortable chaos of a lifetime of learning. Doc Harrington poured them both whiskey and settled into his worn chair with a sigh. "I assume you're here about the Whitmore boy's missing wife," he said without preamble. "She's not missing," Etta said quietly. "She's safe. And she's not going back." Doc Harrington nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "Good. I've treated that girl 3 times in the past 2 years. Accidents, they always said. Fell downstairs, walked into a door, tripped in the dark. But I know what a fist looks like when it hits flesh. I know what boot prints look like on ribs. Why didn't you say anything?" Etta asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "Who would I tell?" The old doctor asked wearily. "The sheriff? He's James's godfather. The mayor? He and the reverend are thick as thieves. And even if I did report it, who would they believe? The town's most respected family, or an old doctor making accusations without proof? The girl herself denied it every time, terrified of making things worse." He took a long drink of his whiskey. "I'm glad she got away. I'm glad she found you. If anyone can keep her safe, it's you. But Etta," he leaned forward, his face grave, "you need to know what you're up against. The Whitmores don't just have reputation and respect protecting them. They have money, power, and a complete lack of conscience when it comes to protecting their interests." "I know," Etta said. "Sarah told me about the land deals, the fraud." "It's worse than fraud," Doc Harrington said. He rose and went to a locked cabinet, pulled out a small wooden box and brought it back to his desk. Inside were papers, letters, what looked like journal pages. "Margaret," he said simply, and Etta's heart stopped. "My Margaret," she whispered. "Your Margaret," he confirmed gently. "She came back, Etta, 5 years ago. She came back looking for you, but the town, they told her you wanted nothing to do with her, that you'd said she was dead to you for leaving. She didn't believe them at first, but they were convincing. So she stayed in town, got work at the boarding house, tried to build a life here instead." "No," Etta breathed, tears streaming down her face. "No, I would never." "I know," Doc Harrington said. "But she didn't, and then she met Reverend Whitmore. He offered her kindness, guidance, told her he'd help her reconcile with you. Instead," his face hardened, "instead he assaulted her. When she tried to report it to seek help, she was threatened, told she'd be run out of town as a liar and a whore, told no one would believe her over a man of God." "Where is she?" Etta asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the sorrow in Doc Harrington's eyes. "She came to me one night, beaten badly, terrified. She gave me this box, told me if anything happened to her, I should hold on to it, that someday someone might need to know the truth. She was going to run, she said, going to go somewhere far away and start over." He paused, and the silence stretched painful and long. "They found her body 3 days later in the river. The official report said she'd jumped, despondent over family troubles. But Etta, I saw her body. Those weren't injuries from jumping. Those were injuries from being beaten and thrown." The room spun around Etta. Margaret, her beautiful, brave daughter, dead, murdered, and she'd died thinking Etta had rejected her, had turned her back, had chosen isolation over her own child. "Why didn't you say something?" Etta asked, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Tell me." "I tried," Doc Harrington said, pain evident in every word. "I went to the sheriff, insisted on an investigation. He told me I was a senile old man, seeing conspiracy where there was only tragedy. The mayor suggested I might want to retire before I damaged my reputation with wild accusations. And the Reverend," his hands clenched on his glass, "the Reverend came to my house and prayed over me, asked God to forgive my suspicious nature and heal my troubled mind. He opened the box and pulled out a journal, Margaret's journal." Etta realized, seeing her daughter's handwriting on the pages. She documented everything. The assault, the threats, the names of other women the Whitmore men had hurt. She was building a case, gathering evidence, and they killed her for it. Etta took the journal, with shaking hands, pressed it to her chest. 20 years of grief, of questions, of wondering, and now she had answers. Terrible answers, but answers nonetheless. "I'm sorry," Doc Harrington said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't do more." I'm sorry I let fear and self-preservation keep me silent. Margaret deserved better. You deserved better. Etta looked up at him, and what he saw in her eyes made him sit back in his chair. It wasn't grief alone, though that was there, deep and profound. It was purpose. It was determination. It was the look of someone who'd just found a reason to fight that transcended personal safety or survival. You can make it right now, she said quietly. Sarah has information about the Whitmore's fraud. You have evidence of Margaret's murder and proof of a pattern of violence against women. Together, we might have enough to bring them down. But I need your help. What do you need? Doc Harrington asked without hesitation. I need you to be ready to testify when the time comes, Etta said. I need you to keep these documents safe. And I need you to tell me, is there anyone else in this town who might stand with us? Anyone who's been hurt by the Whitmores? Anyone who might have information? Anyone who's tired of living under their corruption? Doc Harrington thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. There might be. A few people, not many, but enough perhaps. People who've lost land, people who've had family members hurt, people who suspect but have been too afraid to speak up. If you can promise them protection, if you can show them there's a real chance of justice, they might come forward. Then we need a plan, Etta said. A real plan, not just hiding and hoping. We need to force this into the open, make it impossible for them to sweep it under the rug or silence us the way they've silenced others. She stood, tucking Margaret's journal carefully into her coat. There's a circuit judge that comes through Coldwater Springs twice a year. When's the next visit? 3 weeks, Doc Harrington said. Judge Patricia Morgan. She's fair, honest, not beholden to local politics. Then we have 3 weeks to prepare, Etta said. 3 weeks to gather evidence, build a case, and make sure that when we bring this forward, it's ironclad. Can you help me? I can, he said, rising to stand with her. I should have done this 5 years ago. I should have fought harder for Margaret. But I'll fight now. For her memory, and for that young woman you're protecting, and for all the others who've suffered at the Whitmore's hands. They made their plans quickly. Doc Harrington would quietly reach out to potential witnesses, would secure copies of medical records and official documents that showed patterns of abuse and suspicious deaths. Etta would keep Sarah safe and help her complete her written testimony. And when the judge arrived, they would present everything at once, in public, where it couldn't be ignored or suppressed. It was risky. The Whitmores would fight back with everything they had. But Etta no longer cared about risk. She cared about justice. She cared about making sure her daughter's death meant something. She cared about making sure Sarah and all the women who would come after had a chance at freedom and safety. As she slipped back out into the night, Margaret's journal secured in her coat, Etta felt something she hadn't felt in 20 years. Hope. Not the soft, uncertain hope of better days ahead, but the fierce, burning hope of someone who knows exactly what they're fighting for and refuses to back down, no matter the cost. Etta returned to the cabin just before dawn, moving through the forest with the silent efficiency of someone who'd become part of the mountain itself. Sarah was awake, sitting by the fire with the rifle across her lap, her face tight with worry that eased only slightly when Etta stepped through the door. Thank God, Sarah breathed. I was terrified something had happened to you. Etta set down the pack she'd been carrying and went to warm her hands by the fire. The night had been cold, and the walk back up the mountain had taken its toll on her 62-year-old body, though she'd never admit it. She was quiet for a long moment, her face shadowed with something deeper than exhaustion, grief, anger, and a terrible understanding all mixed together. I went to see Doc Harrington, she finally said, her voice careful, controlled. I needed to know if he had any information about other women who might have been hurt by the Whitmores. Women who might be willing to testify. She sat down heavily in the chair across from Sarah, and for the first time since they'd met, Sarah saw her looking every one of her 62 years. He had information, all right. More than I expected. More than I wanted. Sarah leaned forward, sensing the weight of what was coming. What did he tell you? Etta reached into her coat and pulled out a small wooden box, setting it on the table between them. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing papers, letters, and a leather-bound journal. 20 years ago, when the town drove me out, I had a daughter, Etta said. Her voice tight with emotion she was barely holding back. Margaret. She was 17 when we left. Beautiful, smart, full of fire and independence. She hated being exiled for something that wasn't my fault. Hated being punished for being my daughter. Sarah stayed quiet, letting Etta tell the story at her own pace. When she turned 19, she left for the city. Said she was going to make a new life, become someone other than the mountain woman's daughter. We wrote letters at first. She told me about her job, her friends, her dreams. Etta's voice cracked. Then the letters stopped. Just stopped. I wrote and wrote but got no replies. Eventually I told myself she'd moved on, built a life where having a disgraced mother didn't hold her back. I convinced myself she was happy somewhere, even if she'd chosen to forget me. She picked up the journal with shaking hands. But that's not what happened. Margaret didn't forget me. She didn't abandon me. Etta opened the journal to the first page, and Sarah could see the neat, feminine handwriting dated 5 years earlier. Etta's voice was barely above a whisper as she read, "My name is Margaret Granger. I am 28 years old. I've come back to Coldwater Springs to find my mother, but they tell me she wants nothing to do with me." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. 5 years ago, she breathed. The woman who disappeared. The one in those old letters I found. That was my daughter, Etta said, tears streaming down her face now. My Margaret came home. She came looking for me. But the town told her I'd rejected her, told her I'd become bitter and hateful, that I'd cursed her name for leaving me alone. Doc Harrington says they were convincing, systematic in their lies. They wanted to keep her away from me because, she paused, gathering strength. Because Margaret was asking questions. About the Whitmores, about land deals and vulnerable women, about patterns of abuse and suspicious deaths. Etta flipped through pages, her finger tracing her daughter's words. She documented everything. She met Reverend Whitmore when he offered her spiritual counsel, said he'd help her reconcile with her mother. Instead, her voice broke completely. Sarah reached across and took her hand, squeezing tight. He assaulted her, Etta finished, the words like broken glass in her throat. And when she threatened to report it, when she said she'd tell everyone what kind of man he really was, they threatened her right back. Told her no one would believe her over a man of God. Told her she'd be run out of town as a liar and a whore. Just like her mother, Sarah was crying now too, understanding the full horror of what Etta was revealing. What happened to her? Etta pulled out another document, an official report, yellowed with age. 3 days after she gave this journal to Doc Harrington for safekeeping, they found her body in the river. The official report said suicide, despondent over family troubles, they claimed. A tragic end to a troubled young woman. She looked up at Sarah, and her eyes were blazing with grief and rage. But Doc Harrington examined her body. He documented injuries that told a different story. Injuries consistent with being beaten. Injuries that couldn't have come from jumping into a river. They killed her, Sarah whispered. They murdered her, Etta confirmed. And they made it look like suicide, so no one would ask questions. And her voice broke again. I believed it. I believed my daughter had killed herself. I spent 5 years thinking she'd taken her own life because of despair, because of the stigma of being my child. I blamed myself for her death when all along she couldn't continue. The sobs came then, deep and wrenching. 20 years of isolation and 5 years of misdirected guilt pouring out all at once. Sarah moved to kneel beside her chair, holding her, letting her grieve. When Etta could speak again, her voice was different, harder, colder, filled with purpose. Doc Harrington kept this journal hidden all these years. He tried to get an investigation 5 years ago, tried to tell people that Margaret's death wasn't suicide. But Sheriff Reeves shut him down, called him a senile old man seeing conspiracies. Mayor Pierce suggested he retire before he damaged his reputation. And Reverend Whitmore, she spat the name like poison. Reverend Whitmore came to his house and prayed over him, asked God to heal his troubled mind. She stood, pacing now, energy returning as grief transformed into determination. They've been doing this for years, hurting women, silencing them, killing them when they threaten to expose the truth. And the whole town has been complicit, either actively helping or just looking the way. Sarah picked up the journal, reading through pages with growing horror. Margaret had been meticulous, documenting not just her own assault, but connecting it to a pattern going back years. Names, dates, circumstances. She'd been building a case, gathering evidence. "There's something else," Sarah said suddenly, her face going pale as she read. "Etta, look at this." She pointed to a passage where Margaret had listed other women who'd reported problems with the Whitmore family. Sarah's finger trembled as she read one name aloud. Caroline Mitchell, owned farmland south of town, came to Reverend Whitmore for counsel after her husband died, signed over her property to the church, then died suddenly 6 months later, rumored to have been in good health before. Sarah looked up at Etta, her voice shaking. "Mitchell was my maiden name. Caroline was my aunt. My mother's sister." The two women stared at each other as the full scope of the horror became clear. This wasn't just about Sarah's abuse or Margaret's murder. This was a pattern spanning at least 2 decades, probably more. The Whitmore family had been systematically targeting vulnerable women, exploiting them, silencing them, and in some cases, killing them, all while maintaining their reputation as pillars of the community. "That's why my parents disowned me," Sarah said, understanding dawning. "Not because I was marrying above my station. They knew what happened to Aunt Caroline, and they tried to stop me from marrying James, but I wouldn't listen. I thought they were being controlling, trying to ruin my happiness. So they cut me off completely, rather than watch what they knew would happen." Etta sat back down, her mind working through the implications. "This changes everything. We're not just protecting you from an abusive husband anymore. We're sitting on evidence of multiple murders, decades of fraud, a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful people in Cold Water Springs. They'll kill us if they find out we have this," Sarah said, fear evident in her voice, but also resolve. "They killed Margaret to keep her quiet. They'll do the same to us. Let them try," Etta said quietly, but her voice carried steel. "Because this time, there are witnesses. There's Doc Harrington, who's kept this evidence safe. There are the people we've already contacted who've been hurt by the Whitmores. And there's us, 2 women who have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." She picked up Margaret's journal again, holding it like the precious, terrible thing it was. "My daughter died trying to expose these monsters. She died alone, thinking her mother had rejected her, thinking no one would believe her or fight for her. I can't bring her back. I can't undo those 5 years she spent thinking I didn't love her." Her voice hardened with resolve. "But I can finish what she started. I can make sure her death wasn't meaningless. I can stand up and fight the way I should have fought 20 years ago, the way I should have fought when they drove me out, the way I should have fought every day since." Sarah stood, and when she spoke, her voice was equally determined. "Then we fight together, for Margaret, for my Aunt Caroline, for every woman they've hurt and silenced. We gather every piece of evidence we can find. We build a case so strong they can't ignore it or suppress it. And when Judge Morgan arrives, we make sure the whole town hears the truth. They won't go down without a fight," Etta warned. "They have power, money, influence. They've gotten away with this for decades. They know how to manipulate people, how to turn public opinion, how to make victims look like liars. But we have the truth," Sarah countered. "And we have each other. And we have Margaret's words written in her own hand, documenting everything. That's more than anyone has had before." Etta looked at the young woman standing before her, no longer the broken, terrified victim who'd collapsed on her porch, but someone strong and purposeful. And she realized that Sarah reminded her of Margaret. That same fire, that same refusal to accept injustice, that same courage in the face of overwhelming odds. "You would have liked her," Etta said softly. "Margaret, you remind me of her. I wish I could have met her," Sarah replied. "But I'll honor her memory by helping finish what she started." As dawn light began to filter through the cabin windows, the 2 women sat together, reading through Margaret's journal page by page, absorbing every detail, understanding the full scope of what they were up against. The evidence was damning: names, dates, Witnesses who'd been intimidated into silence, financial records that showed fraud, medical observations that contradicted official reports. Margaret had died gathering this information. But her death would not be in vain. Etta felt something shift inside her. The grief was still there, would always be there. But alongside it now burned something else. Purpose, rage, determination. For 20 years she'd been running, hiding, accepting exile and isolation as her fate. No more. The mountain woman was done hiding. She had a daughter to avenge, a young woman to protect, and a town full of silence to shatter. And when the Whitmores came looking, and they would come looking, they would find not a frightened hermit or a helpless victim, but two women armed with truth and willing to risk everything to see justice done. Outside, the sun rose over the mountain, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that looked like fire. And inside the cabin, two women who'd been broken by the same family's cruelty made a pact to stand together, to fight together, and to make sure that this time the truth would not be silenced. The standoff in the clearing lasted only moments longer before Sheriff Reeves made his decision. He stepped between the Reverend and his deputies, his hand moving away from his gun. "That's enough," he said quietly. "Reverend, I'm not ordering my men to assault civilians or destroy property without cause. If these people want to testify before Judge Morgan, that's their right. We'll let the law decide what's true and what isn't." The Reverend's face contorted with rage. "You're as weak as your son was. Dalton, soft, unwilling to do what's necessary to protect the righteous. The mention of his dead son, the child Etta had tried to save 20 years ago, made the sheriff's jaw clench. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I'm finally doing what I should have done back then, questioning whether the righteous are as righteous as they claim to be." He turned to his deputies. "We're leaving. All of us. Now." The Reverend stood alone in the clearing, his authority crumbling, his mask of benevolence completely shattered. He looked at Etta with pure hatred. "You've made a grave mistake," he said softly. "All of you. You have no idea what you've started." "I know exactly what I've started," Etta replied calmly. "Justice. Long overdue." The Reverend mounted his horse and rode off, the sheriff and deputies following at a distance. But Etta knew this was far from over. A cornered animal was at its most dangerous, and the Whitmores had far too much to lose to simply accept defeat. Once they were gone, Doc Harrington and the witnesses came forward. Etta learned their names and stories. Helen Marsh, whose father's land had been stolen. Rebecca Cole, who'd been assaulted by James and driven from town. Thomas Brennan, whose wife had signed away their savings to the church and then died under suspicious circumstances. "There are others," Doc Harrington said quietly. "At least 6 more who might be willing to testify if they see others standing up first." Fear has kept them silent, but courage is contagious. Over the next 2 weeks, Etta's cabin became an unlikely headquarters for something that started to resemble a resistance. People came up the mountain in ones and twos, at first terrified, then emboldened by finding others who'd suffered similar injustices. Each brought pieces of the puzzle, documents, testimonies, physical evidence that had been hidden away for years out of fear. Sarah worked tirelessly, organizing everything, creating a comprehensive timeline of the Whitmores' crimes that stretched back nearly 20 years. She had a mind for details, for seeing patterns and connections that others might miss. She cross-referenced testimonies, matched dates to land transactions, built a case that was becoming ironclad. Etta watched her with pride and something deeper, the recognition that Sarah had transformed from victim to advocate, from someone who needed protection to someone who could protect others. The frightened, broken woman who'd stumbled to her door in a storm was gone, replaced by someone fierce and determined and unbreakable. But the danger was escalating. 2 of the potential witnesses received threatening messages, notes slipped under doors, warning them that traitors to the community would face consequences. Helen Marsh found her barn set on fire one night, though she and her neighbors managed to save it before too much damage was done. Thomas Brennan was followed home from town by men he didn't recognize. "They're trying to intimidate us," Sarah said at one of their evening meetings, her voice steady despite the fear in the room, "trying to make us too scared to testify. We can't let them win." "Easy for you to say," Thomas muttered. "You're safe up here on the mountain. Some of us still have to live down there, with them watching our every move." "Then come stay here," Etta said. "All of you. Bring your families if you need to. We have 3 days until Judge Morgan arrives. We can hold out that long, all of us together." And so Etta's cabin became a sanctuary for 8 people who'd found the courage to stand against corruption. It was crowded, uncomfortable, and tense, but there was also a strange sense of community forming. People who'd been isolated in their suffering discovered they weren't alone. Stories were shared, support was offered, and slowly, something like hope began to grow. Etta created a detailed map of Coldwater Springs, marking every important location: the courthouse where Judge Morgan would hear testimonies, the church where the Whitmores held court, the sheriff's office, the mayor's residence. She studied it like a general planning a campaign, because in a way, that's exactly what this was. "The courthouse is the key," she explained to the group one evening. "We need to get there safely, all of us, with our evidence intact. The Whitmores will try to stop us. They have to, because once we testify publicly, once Judge Morgan hears everything, they're finished. How do we get there without being intercepted?" Rebecca asked. "We go together," Etta said. "In daylight, in full view of the entire town. We make it a spectacle, impossible to ignore or suppress. We want witnesses, lots of them. The more people who see us, the harder it will be for the Whitmores to claim we never showed up, or that something unfortunate happened to us on the way," Sarah added. "And we make copies of everything. Multiple copies. Some stay here, some go with each person, some are already with Doc Harrington. If they try to destroy evidence, there's always more." "What about James?" Helen asked quietly. "We haven't seen him since this started." "Where is he?" It was a good question, and one that worried Etta. James Whitmore was the weakest link in the family chain, violent, unpredictable, prone to acting on emotion rather than strategy. His absence suggested he was either being controlled by his father or was planning something on his own. Either possibility was dangerous. That night, Etta and Sarah took a watch shift together, sitting on the porch in the cold autumn air, wrapped in blankets, rifles across their laps. The stars were brilliant overhead, and for a moment the danger seemed distant. "Are you scared?" Sarah asked softly. "Terrified," Etta admitted. "But not of dying. I've lived 62 years, most of them good enough. What scares me is failing. Letting these people down, letting Margaret's death remain unavenged, letting you and all the others who've been hurt continue to live in fear." "We won't fail," Sarah said with quiet certainty. "We can't, because if we do, if we let fear win, then nothing changes. The cycle continues. But if we stand up, if we face this head-on, even if the worst happens, even if we don't survive, we'll have changed something. We'll have shown that resistance is possible, that silence and submission aren't the only options." Etta reached over and squeezed her hand. "When did you become so wise?" "When I had a teacher who showed me that strength isn't about never being afraid," Sarah replied. "It's about being afraid and acting anyway. You taught me that, Etta. By example, 2 days before Judge Morgan's arrival, Doc Harrington brought news that changed their strategy. "James showed up at my office this morning," he said, his face grave. "Drunk, aggressive, demanding to know where his wife was. I told him I had no idea. He threatened me. Said if I testified against his family, he'd burn my house down with me in it. We need to be ready for him to do something desperate," Etta said. "He's unraveling, losing control. That makes him more dangerous than his father, who at least thinks strategically." They spent the final 2 days preparing, not just evidence and testimony, but practical defenses. Etta showed them escape routes, defensive positions, ways to protect themselves if violence erupted. They practiced moving as a group, staying together, watching out for each other. Sarah organized their departure down to the minute. Who would carry what order they'd walk in, what signals they'd use if they spotted danger. She'd become the logistical backbone of their operation. and Etta could see leadership qualities emerging that would serve her well in whatever life came after this confrontation. On the evening before Judge Morgan's arrival, they gathered one last time around Etta's fire. 8 people who'd been strangers weeks ago, now bound together by shared purpose and mutual protection. Etta looked at each face, weathered by life but determined, frightened but courageous, scarred but healing. "Tomorrow we walk into Coldwater Springs," she said quietly. "Tomorrow we tell our truths in a place where they can't be silenced or ignored. Some of you will testify about fraud, some about assault, some about murder. All of it matters. All of it is part of the pattern we're exposing." She paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. "The Whitmores will fight back with everything they have. They'll try to discredit us, threaten us, maybe even harm us. But we have something they don't. We have the truth, and we have each other. As long as we stand together, as long as we don't let them divide us or frighten us into silence, we will win." "What if we don't?" Thomas asked quietly. "What if Judge Morgan doesn't believe us? What if the town sides with the Whitmores anyway?" "Then we'll have tried," Etta said simply. "And that's more than anyone has done before. But I don't think it'll come to that. I think once people hear everything, once they see the full picture of corruption and violence and lies, they'll have to act. Because good people, when confronted with evil, have a choice. They can look away or they can stand up. And I have to believe there are enough good people in Coldwater Springs to tip the balance." Sarah stood, raising a cup of water like a toast. "To justice," she said firmly. "For Margaret, for Caroline, for all the others, and for ourselves, for the lives we're fighting to reclaim. To justice," they echoed. And in that moment, crowded into a cabin on a mountain, hunted and threatened but unbroken, they were magnificent. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation. Tomorrow, everything they'd built and prepared would be tested. Tomorrow, the mountain woman and her unlikely allies would face the most powerful family in Coldwater Springs and demand accountability. But tonight, they had this: community, courage, and the unshakable conviction that some things were worth fighting for. No matter the cost, dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain. The kind of autumn morning where the air itself seemed crystalline, sharp with possibility. Etta stood on her porch one last time, looking at the cabin that had been her refuge for 20 years. It felt different now, not a hiding place but a launching point, not isolation but preparation for return. Inside, the group was making final preparations. Sarah had divided the evidence into multiple parcels, each person carrying portions so that if anyone was intercepted, the full case would still survive. Doc Harrington had his medical records and Margaret's journal. Helen carried land transaction documents. Rebecca had physical evidence from her assault. Thomas had financial records showing the pattern of fraud. Etta checked her rifle one final time, then left it behind. This wasn't a battle to be won with weapons, but with words and truth. Instead, she took only Margaret's locket, pressing it against her heart beneath her coat. Her daughter would be with her today in spirit if not in flesh. "Everyone ready?" she asked, and received nods all around. Fear was present on every face, but so was determination. They'd come too far to turn back now. They left the cabin in a tight group, moving down the mountain trail in the order Sarah had planned. Etta led, with Sarah close behind, the others following in pairs. They moved deliberately, making no attempt to hide or rush. This was a procession, not a flight. The trail down was treacherous in places, steep and rocky, but they navigated it safely. As they descended, they could see Coldwater Springs spread out in the valley below, small, familiar, deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Smoke rose from chimneys. Church bells rang, calling people to morning services. Life continuing as if nothing was about to change. But everything was about to change. They reached the edge of town an hour before Judge Morgan was due to arrive. Word of their approach had somehow spread, whether through Doc Harrington's careful messages or simply through the mysterious way small towns sensed drama and people were gathering in the streets. Some faces were hostile. loyal to the Whitmores and suspicious of accusations against such a respected family. But others showed curiosity, and a few showed something like hope, people who'd suspected, who'd known, who'd been waiting for someone to finally speak truth to power. The walk through town felt eternal. Every step brought them closer to the courthouse, and every step brought more people out of houses and shops to watch. Etta kept her head high, her pace steady. Beside her, Sarah walked with equal dignity, no longer the beaten woman who'd fled in terror, but someone transformed by purpose. They were halfway to the courthouse when James Whitmore appeared. He stepped out from an alley. Drunk even at this early hour, his face twisted with rage and pain. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes wild. This was a man who'd lost control of everything: his wife, his reputation, his carefully constructed life. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking. "Sarah, please come home. We can work this out. I love you. I'm sorry for everything. Just come home." Sarah stopped, and for a moment Etta feared she might actually consider it. The pull of familiar patterns, of learned helplessness, of the cycle of abuse. It was powerful even for someone who'd broken free. But then Sarah spoke, and her voice was clear and strong. "No, James, I'm not coming home. I'm going to tell the truth about what you did to me, what your family has done to so many others. And no amount of apologies or promises will change that." James's expression shifted from pleading to threatening in an instant. "You ungrateful. You have no idea what you're doing. My father will destroy you. All of you. You think some circuit judge is going to believe a bunch of liars and troublemakers over us?" "Yes," Sarah said simply, "I do. Because we're telling the truth, and truth has a way of being heard." Eventually, James took a step forward, his hand moving toward Sarah, and instantly Etta was between them, her stance protective, her eyes blazing. "You touch her, and I will make you regret it," Etta said quietly, and something in her voice made James step back. "This is your fault," he snarled at Etta. "You poisoned her against me. You and your witch medicines and your lies. My father was right about you 20 years ago. You should have been driven out permanently. Your father was a coward who blamed an innocent woman for his own failures," Etta replied calmly. "Just like you're doing now. The pattern runs deep in your family. Blame others, hide the truth, pretend righteousness while committing evil. But that ends today." Sheriff Reeves appeared then, moving through the growing crowd. He looked tired, older than his years, but there was something different about him now. A resignation, maybe, or an acceptance of long-avoided truths. "James, go home," he said wearily. "Sleep it off. Don't make this worse than it already is." "Worse?" James laughed bitterly. "It can't get worse. My wife has run off with that mountain witch. She's spreading lies about me, about my family. And you're just going to let them waltz into that courthouse and destroy everything we've built? If what they're saying is lies, then a court will expose that," the sheriff said. "But if it's truth," he paused, his gaze moving to Etta. "If it's truth, then maybe it's time it came out." The crowd had grown larger now, nearly filling the street. Etta could see Reverend Whitmore standing on the church steps, his face pale with fury, Mayor Pierce beside him looking calculating and nervous. They knew they'd lost control of the narrative, lost the ability to suppress and intimidate. A carriage rounded the corner then, official and imposing. Judge Patricia Morgan had arrived. She was exactly as Doc Harrington had described, a woman in her 60s, stern-faced but with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She surveyed the scene before her. The crowd, the tension, the clear divide between those who'd come to testify and those who opposed them. "Well," she said dryly, stepping down from her carriage, "this is certainly more excitement than I usually encounter in Coldwater Springs." "Sheriff Reeves, what's going on here?" "Your Honor." Etta stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly. "My name is Etta Granger. These people with me have come to present testimony and evidence regarding a pattern of fraud, assault, and murder committed by the Whitmore family over the past 20 years. We request the opportunity to present our case formally and publicly." Judge Morgan's eyebrows rose. "Those are serious accusations. I assume you have evidence to support them?" "We do, Your Honor," Doc Harrington said, stepping forward with his medical bag full of documents. Substantial evidence, multiple witnesses, physical proof. Everything properly documented and verified. The judge looked at Reverend Whitmore, who was descending from the church steps, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "Reverend, these people are accusing your family of terrible crimes. What do you say to these charges?" "I say they are lies, Your Honor," the Reverend said smoothly, though Etta could see the desperation beneath his calm exterior. "Malicious lies spread by troubled individuals with grudges against our family. This woman," he pointed at Etta, "was exiled from this town 20 years ago for malpractice that resulted in a child's death. Her own daughter committed suicide because of her mother's madness. And now she's trying to destroy my family out of spite and bitterness." "My daughter didn't commit suicide," Etta said, her voice cutting through the crowd noise like a blade. "She was murdered by you. And I have her journal, written in her own hand, documenting everything you did to her, everything you threatened, everything you are." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Morgan raised her hand for silence. "This requires a formal hearing," she said decisively. "Sheriff, clear the courthouse. We'll convene immediately. Both sides will present their evidence and testimony. I'll hear everything and make my determinations based on the law and the facts, not on reputation or emotion." She looked directly at the Reverend. "And Reverend Whitmore, I suggest you secure legal representation. Based on the seriousness of these accusations, you're going to need it." As they moved toward the courthouse, Etta felt Sarah's hand slip into hers, squeezing tight. They'd made it this far. Now came the hard part, convincing a judge and by extension a town that their carefully maintained illusions about the Whitmore family were built on lies and violence and corruption. But as they climbed the courthouse steps, Etta looked back at the crowd and saw something that gave her hope. Mixed in with the hostile faces were others, women mostly, watching with tears in their eyes, as if seeing something they'd longed for but never dared hope for. Validation, justice, the possibility that silence wasn't the only option. The mountain woman had come down from her exile, and she'd brought the truth with her. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, every bench filled, people standing along the walls and crowding the doorway. Judge Morgan had to call for order 3 times before the room settled enough to begin. She sat behind the bench, her gavel in hand, her expression stern and focused. "This is an extraordinary hearing," she began, her voice carrying authority. "I will hear testimony and examine evidence regarding accusations against Thomas Whitmore, his son James Whitmore, Mayor Franklin Pierce, and others. Given the gravity of these accusations, I'm allowing public attendance, but I will tolerate no outbursts, no interruptions. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed. Is that understood?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Mrs. Granger," the judge said, turning to Etta, "you initiated these accusations. Present your case." Etta stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on her. She thought of Margaret, of Daniel, of all the years of silence and isolation. And she began to speak. 20 years ago, I was driven from this town for trying to save a child's life. I failed to save him, but not through negligence or malice, simply because sometimes medicine isn't enough. But Reverend Whitmore used that tragedy to paint me as dangerous, unnatural, a threat to the community. I accepted exile because I had no strength left to fight." She paused, making sure every word landed clearly. "But 5 years ago, my daughter Margaret came back to Coldwater Springs. She was told I wanted nothing to do with her, a lie designed to isolate her. She stayed in town, and Reverend Whitmore offered her kindness and guidance. Instead, he assaulted her. When she tried to report it, she was threatened and silenced. 3 days after she gave this journal to Doc Harrington for safekeeping, her body was found in the river. She held up Margaret's journal, and the courtroom went utterly silent. The official report said suicide," Etta continued, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "But Doc Harrington examined her body. He can testify to injuries inconsistent with drowning, injuries that indicate she was beaten and thrown into that river. My daughter was murdered because she threatened to expose the truth about the Whitmore family. Judge Morgan leaned forward. Dr. Harrington, is this accurate? Doc Harrington stood, his old voice strong and clear. It is, Your Honor. I documented my findings at the time, though they were ignored by local authorities. I have those records here, along with Margaret's journal detailing the assault and subsequent threats. The judge accepted the documents, examining them carefully. The Reverend stood, his face red with fury. This is outrageous. These are fabrications. That woman's daughter was unstable. Everyone knew it. She made wild accusations and then took her own life out of shame for lying about a man of God. Then perhaps you can explain, Sarah said, standing suddenly, her voice ringing through the courtroom. Why I found a handkerchief with your initials in your son's possession, perfumed with a scent that wasn't mine. Or why, when I confronted James about his infidelity, he beat me so badly I nearly died. Or why I had to flee into a storm to save my own life. She began unbuttoning her sleeve. And Etta saw what she was doing, showing the scars, making the violence visible and undeniable. These are from my husband, Sarah continued, displaying her arm to the judge, to the crowd. Broken bone that healed crooked because I was too afraid to see a doctor. Burns from cigars. Cuts from when he threw me into furniture. 2 years of systematic torture while your community praised him as a godly man, preparing to lead your church. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some people looked away, ashamed. Others stared in horror, seeing clearly for the first time what they'd chosen not to see before. Rebecca Cole stood next. James Whitmore assaulted me 2 years ago after a church social. I was 17. When I tried to tell my parents, his father came to our house and called me a liar, said I was trying to trap his son into marriage for money. I was run out of town, but I kept evidence, clothing, a physician's report from the city where I fled. James Whitmore is a predator, protected by his family's reputation. One by one, they testified. Helen Marsh spoke of land fraud. Thomas Brennan documented financial manipulation. 3 more people came forward from the crowd itself, emboldened by the others' courage, no longer able to stay silent. Judge Morgan examined every piece of evidence with meticulous care. She read Margaret's journal, her face growing increasingly grim. She studied medical records, financial documents, property transfers. She questioned witnesses, probing for inconsistencies, but finding none. Finally, she turned to Reverend Whitmore. Sir, you stand accused of assault, murder, fraud, and conspiracy. What is your defense? The Reverend's composure had cracked completely. These people are conspirators. They've fabricated evidence. They're trying to destroy a family that has served this community faithfully for 3 generations. By stealing from vulnerable people? The judge asked coldly. By assaulting women? By murdering those who threaten to expose you? I've done nothing wrong, the Reverend shouted. I am a man of God. My family has built this town. We deserve respect, not these vicious lies. Respect is earned, Judge Morgan said quietly, not demanded. And based on the evidence before me, you and your family have done nothing to earn it. She stood, and the courtroom fell silent. I'm ordering the immediate arrest of Thomas Whitmore on suspicion of murder, assault, and fraud. James Whitmore is to be arrested on charges of domestic violence and assault. Mayor Pierce, you will answer charges of conspiracy and fraud. Sheriff Reeves, the sheriff stood, looking 10 years older. Your Honor, I'll carry out the arrests myself. And, he turned to Etta, his eyes filled with regret. I owe you an apology. 20 years overdue. I blamed you for my son's death because I couldn't face my own guilt. I turned you into a scapegoat. And I've allowed corruption to flourish because I was too much a coward to stand against my friends. I'm sorry. Etta nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. Deputies moved to arrest the Reverend, but James suddenly lunged from his seat, pulling a gun from his coat. The courtroom erupted in screams and chaos. No, James shouted, waving the gun wildly. You're not taking my father. You're not destroying everything we've built. He pointed the gun at Sarah, his hand shaking, his eyes wild with desperation and rage. This is your fault. All of this is your fault. If you'd just been a good wife, if you'd just kept your mouth shut. James, Sheriff Reeves said calmly, moving slowly toward him. Put the gun down. This is over. Don't make it worse. Worse? James laughed, a sound of breaking sanity. How could it be worse? My life is destroyed. My family is ruined. All because of her. Etta moved then, stepping deliberately between the gun and Sarah, her body shielding the younger woman. If you're going to shoot someone, she said quietly, shoot me. I'm the one who started all this. I'm the one who gave Sarah sanctuary. I'm the one who brought everything into the light. Your anger should be directed at me, not at a woman who did nothing but try to survive your cruelty. Etta, no. Sarah started to say, but Etta held up a hand to silence her. I'm an old woman. James, Etta continued, her voice calm, almost gentle. I've lived a full life. I've seen my daughter avenged, seen justice begin to take root. If my death is what it takes to end this, to make sure Sarah and all the others are finally safe, then so be it. For a long moment, James stood frozen, the gun pointed at Etta's chest. The courtroom held its collective breath. Then slowly, the gun lowered. James's face crumpled and he began to sob, deep, wrenching sobs of a man whose entire identity had shattered. I didn't want this, he whispered. I didn't want any of this. I just wanted... The sheriff took the gun gently from his hand and guided him to the floor. Deputies moved in to make the arrests, the Reverend still protesting, James broken and weeping. Mayor Pierce trying to bargain his way out, even as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. Judge Morgan's gavel came down with finality. These men will be held for trial. All evidence will be preserved. And this community... She looked out at the stunned, silent crowd. Will have to reckon with how such corruption was allowed to flourish for so long. Justice has been delayed, but it will not be denied. As the prisoners were led away, Sarah threw her arms around Etta, both women shaking with relief and exhaustion, and the overwhelming weight of finally being believed, finally being heard. Around them, the courtroom slowly emptied, but not before several people approached, some to apologize, some to thank them, some simply to acknowledge that they'd known, they'd suspected, and they were ashamed it took this long for anyone to act. The mountain woman and her allies had won. Not just a legal victory, but something deeper. They'd broken the silence that had protected evil for so long. And in doing so, they'd shown that courage, however long delayed, could still triumph over corruption and fear. 3 months had passed since that day in the courthouse, and autumn had given way to winter's first snow. The mountain wore a coat of white that sparkled in the morning sun, pristine and peaceful, as if the earth itself was celebrating a new beginning. Etta stood on her porch, coffee steaming in her hands, watching the smoke rise from the chimney of the small addition that had been built onto the side of her cabin. The guest room, though it had become so much more than that. It had become a sanctuary, a safe harbor, a place where women who needed refuge could find it without judgment or conditions. Sarah emerged from the main cabin, wrapped in a thick shawl, carrying her own cup of tea. She'd filled out in the months since the trial, no longer gaunt with fear and stress. Her face had lost that haunted look, replaced with something that could almost be called contentment. She still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at sudden movements, but she was healing, body and soul both. Morning, Sarah said, settling into the chair beside Etta. Emma's still sleeping. Poor thing was up half the night, finally feeling safe enough to cry properly. Emma was the third woman who'd come to them since the trial. Word had spread, quietly, carefully, through networks of women who whispered to each other about a place in the mountains where you could go if you needed help, where the mountain woman would take you in and ask no questions except how to help you heal. Let her sleep, Etta said. Sleep is part of the healing. She'll wake when she's ready. The trials had concluded 2 weeks ago. Reverend Thomas Whitmore had been convicted of second-degree murder in Margaret's death, along with fraud, conspiracy, and assault. He'd been sentenced to 20 years in prison. James Whitmore had received 15 years for assault and attempted murder. Mayor Pierce had gotten 10 for fraud and conspiracy. Sheriff Reeves had resigned in disgrace, though he'd avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully with the investigation. Coldwater Springs had been shaken to its foundation. 3 generations of Whitmore leadership had crumbled in a single day, and the town was still trying to figure out who they were without that. Family's influence shaping every decision and defining every value. Some people were angry at Etta, and Sarah saw them as troublemakers who destroyed the town's reputation and stability. But others, more and more each day, were grateful. Women especially, who'd lived with their own secrets, their own fears, their own knowledge of abuse that they'd been too frightened to speak about. They saw Etta's cabin as proof that survival was possible, that speaking truth could lead to justice rather than punishment. Doc Harrington visited regularly now, bringing supplies and news from town. He'd become the unofficial liaison between the mountain and the valley, respected by both sides, and trusted to tell the truth without embellishment or bias. The new sheriff is investigating other cases, he'd told them last week, looking into suspicious deaths and disappearances going back 20 years. Your testimony opened floodgates, Etta. People are coming forward with information they've kept hidden for decades. The full scope of what the Whitmores did, it's still being uncovered. Etta had mixed feelings about that. Part of her was glad that all the truth was finally coming to light. But another part grieved for all the years that had been lost, all the suffering that could have been prevented if people had found courage sooner. But she understood why they hadn't. Fear was powerful, and a town that had built its identity on the goodness and righteousness of one family didn't want to face the cognitive dissonance of discovering that family was corrupt. It was easier to look away, to make excuses, to blame the victims rather than confront the perpetrators. What she and Sarah had done, what all of them together had done, was refuse to look away. And in that refusal, they'd changed not just individual lives, but the entire culture of silence that had protected evil for so long. Sarah had blossomed in the months since the trial. She'd become Etta's partner in running the sanctuary, learning not just herbcraft and healing, but also the emotional work of helping traumatized women find their strength again. She had a gift for it, born of her own experience. She knew what it felt like to be broken, so she knew how to help others mend. "I've been thinking," Sarah said now, watching the sunrise paint the snow gold and pink, "about expanding. Building another room, maybe 2? We could help more women if we had more space." "We could," Etta agreed. "Though we'd need help." "I'm 62, Sarah. I can't build like I used to." "We have help," Sarah said, smiling. "Thomas Brennan offered to do the carpentry. Ellen Marsh said she'd donate lumber from her property. And at least 6 women from town have volunteered to help however they can. Cooking, cleaning, building, whatever we need." Etta felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Then we'll expand," she said. "We'll build something that can last, something that can help women long after we're gone." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the day brighten. Then Sarah asked, "Do you ever regret it, the isolation you gave up? The peace and quiet you had before I stumbled onto your porch?" Etta thought about it carefully, wanting to answer honestly. "No," she finally said. "I thought I wanted isolation, thought it was the same as peace. But it wasn't. It was just hiding, dressed up as independence. Real peace, the kind I feel now, comes from purpose, from connection, from knowing your life matters beyond just your own survival." She reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. "You didn't just save yourself by coming here. You saved me, too. Gave me a reason to stop hiding and start living again. We saved each other," Sarah said softly. "And now we're helping others save themselves." As the morning wore on, Emma emerged from the guest room, eyes red from crying, but clearer than they'd been when she arrived. Etta and Sarah made breakfast together, simple fare, but warm and nourishing. They ate at the table that had once been set for 1, then 2, now 3, and sometimes more. After breakfast, Etta took Emma outside, began teaching her the same lessons she'd taught Sarah: how to identify useful plants, how to move quietly through the forest, how to build a fire, how to navigate by stars and landmarks. Skills that were practical, yes, but that also served a deeper purpose, helping women understand that they were capable, strong, able to take care of themselves. In the afternoon, Sarah worked with Emma on reading from Etta's medicine journal, the same way Etta had worked with her. Knowledge passed from woman to woman, generation to generation, a gift that could never be taken away. As evening approached and they gathered around the fire for dinner, there was a knock at the door. They looked at each other, alert but no longer afraid. Etta went to answer it and found a woman standing in the snow, young, maybe 20, with a bruised face and frightened eyes. "I heard," the woman whispered, "that this is a place where women can come, that you help. Is that true?" Etta looked at her, at another life that could be saved, another story that could be rewritten, another woman who'd found the courage to choose survival over submission. "It's true," Etta said, opening the door wide. "Come in. You're safe now." As the woman stepped across the threshold, Sarah brought blankets and tea, Emma offered a gentle smile of understanding, and Etta felt the pattern continuing, the cycle of healing, the passing of strength from one woman to another, the transformation of pain into purpose. Later that night, after the new arrival was settled and sleeping, Etta stood once more on her porch, looking up at the stars. She thought about Margaret, buried in the town cemetery now with a proper headstone that told the truth about how she died. She thought about Daniel, whose memory had guided her even in the darkest times. She thought about all the women who'd come through her door and all those who would come in the years ahead. 20 years ago, she'd fled to this mountain broken and defeated, seeking only to escape judgment and pain. She'd built walls, kept the world at bay, survived but not truly lived. But in opening her door to one desperate woman on a stormy night, she'd found a way back to herself. She'd discovered that isolation wasn't strength, connection was. That silence wasn't protection, truth was. That the greatest form of resistance against cruelty and corruption was simply refusing to accept them as inevitable. Refusing to stay quiet. Refusing to let fear dictate the boundaries of what was possible. The mountain stood eternal around her, witness to transformation and redemption. And in her cabin, no longer a hermit's refuge but a beacon of hope, the fire burned warm and steady, promising light in darkness, safety in storm, and the possibility that even the most broken among us can heal, can grow strong, can help others find their way home. Sometimes the people we judge the hardest are the ones who end up saving us. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find the courage to stand up for what's right. Etta Granger had learned both lessons, and in learning them, had become exactly who she was always meant to be, not the mountain woman the town feared and whispered about, but a guardian, a healer, a fierce protector of those who had nowhere else to turn. And as snow continued to fall softly around her cabin, covering the mountain in fresh white possibility, Etta knew that this was what Margaret would have wanted. That her death not be the end of the story, but the beginning of something larger, something that would protect and empower women for generations to come. Justice had been served. Truth had been told, and in a cabin on a mountain, surrounded by women learning to be strong again, Etta Granger finally found peace, not in isolation, but in community, not in silence, but in speaking truth, not in hiding from the world, but in changing it, one rescued life at a time.